Jake Matthews stood on his porch at dawn, watching the dust cloud grow larger on the horizon. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, but he didn't notice. He knew what that dust cloud meant. She was coming. The woman from the city who thought she could run his ranch for a week. The woman his late father had trusted with half the property in his will. The woman Jake had never met but already resented with every fiber of his being. The truck pulled up, and out stepped someone who looked nothing like he expected. Sarah Chen wasn't wearing designer boots or carrying expensive luggage. She wore worn jeans, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen real work. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her dark eyes assessed the ranch with an intensity that made Jake uncomfortable. She didn't smile. She didn't offer her hand. She just looked at him and said, "You must be Jake. Your father told me you'd be difficult." Those words hit him like a punch to the gut. His father had been dead for 3 months, and the wound was still raw. The old man had left the ranch to Jake, but with one bizarre condition. Sarah Chen, a woman his father had mentored years ago in some business venture Jake knew nothing about, had the right to run the ranch for 1 week every year. If Jake refused, he'd lose everything. The lawyers had been clear. This wasn't a suggestion. It was law. "My father made a lot of mistakes," Jake said, his voice harder than he intended. "Looks like you were one of them." Sarah didn't flinch. She walked past him into the house like she owned it, which, in a way, she did. Jake followed, anger building in his chest. This was his home. His land. His life. Who was this stranger to walk in and take control? Inside, Sarah dropped her bag by the door and pulled out a folder thick with papers. She spread them across the kitchen table that Jake's grandfather had built with his own hands. "I've reviewed your finances," she said, her finger tracing lines of numbers that made Jake's stomach turn. "You're 3 months from bankruptcy. The cattle operation is bleeding money. Your equipment is ancient. Your workforce is half what it should be. If something doesn't change, you'll lose this place by Christmas." Jake wanted to argue, but the numbers didn't lie. He'd been struggling since his father died, trying to keep everything running the way it always had. But feed costs had skyrocketed. A drought had damaged his pastures. 2 of his best ranch hands had left for better pay elsewhere. He'd been holding on by his fingernails, too proud to admit he was drowning. "I don't need a stranger telling me how to run my ranch," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than business in her eyes. It might have been sympathy. It might have been understanding. "Your father saved my life once," she said quietly. "I was 22, broke, and about to lose everything I'd worked for. He didn't have to help me, but he did. He taught me how to see things differently. How to take something broken and make it whole again. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd do the same for you." Jake felt his throat tighten. His father had never mentioned Sarah. Never explained this arrangement. Now the old man was gone, and Jake was left with questions that would never be answered. "1 week," Sarah said, standing up. "Give me 7 days. If things aren't better by the time I leave, you never have to see me again. The contract becomes void. But if I'm right, if I can show you a way forward, you keep this ranch and everything your family built. Deal?" Jake looked around the kitchen. At the photographs of 4 generations of Matthews men who had worked this land. At the view through the window of fields and fences that carried his blood and sweat. He thought about his father, about the secrets the old man had kept, about trust and legacy and last chances. 1 week, he agreed, not knowing he'd just made the most important decision of his life. Sarah started before sunrise the next morning. Jake woke to the sound of his own truck starting, and by the time he pulled on his boots and stumbled outside, she was gone. He found her 2 hours later in the south pasture, standing in mud up to her ankles, examining the irrigation system that had been broken for months. She'd already called 3 contractors and had 2 of them scheduled to come out that afternoon. "You can't just spend money we don't have," Jake protested, but Sarah cut him off with a look. "Stop thinking like you're dying and start thinking like you're building something," she said. "That's your first problem. You're in survival mode. Every decision you make is about getting through today, not about where you'll be in 6 months. Your father didn't raise you to be a survivor. He raised you to be a fighter." The words stung because they were true. Since his father died, Jake had been paralyzed by fear. Fear of making the wrong choice. Fear of dishing his father's memory. Fear of being the Matthews who lost everything. That fear had turned him into exactly what Sarah described, someone just trying not to drown. She put him to work immediately. While contractors fixed the irrigation, Sarah had Jake inventory every piece of equipment on the property. Every tractor, every tool, every spare part. She made him write down the condition of each item, the last time it was serviced, and what it would cost to replace. The task took all day, and by evening, Jake's hands were covered in grease and his notebook was full of uncomfortable truths. You've got $40,000 in equipment that doesn't work and another $60,000 in redundant tools you never use, Sarah said, reviewing his notes over dinner. She'd cooked, which had surprised him. Chicken and vegetables, simple but good. Sell half of it. Use that money to fix what matters and upgrade what you actually need. You're sitting on a fortune in scrap metal while you're worried about paying bills. The second day, Sarah reorganized the entire feeding schedule for the cattle. Jake had been feeding them the same way his father had, but Sarah showed him how much feed was being wasted, how the timing was inefficient, and how a few simple changes could cut costs by 30% while actually improving the herd's health. She'd brought in a livestock nutritionist, someone she'd worked with before, who spent 3 hours teaching Jake things he'd never learned in all his years on the ranch. By the third day, Jake stopped resisting and started listening. Sarah had a way of explaining things that made sense. She didn't talk down to him or make him feel stupid. She just showed him the numbers, the logic, the reality of what was happening versus what could happen. She treated the ranch like a business because that's what it was, but she also understood it was a home, a legacy, a way of life. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set over the western fields. The sky was painted in oranges and purples, and for the first time in months, Jake felt something other than dread when he looked at his land. He felt possibility. Your father talked about you all the time, Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. He was so proud of you. But he worried. He said you had all the skill in the world but you were afraid to trust yourself. Afraid to make changes because you thought keeping things the same was the same as honoring him. Jake swallowed hard. I just didn't want to let him down. You can't let down a man who believed in you completely, Sarah replied. But you can let down yourself. That's what he was afraid of. That you'd be so busy trying to be him that you'd forget to be you. The words settled into Jake's chest like stones, heavy and true. He'd been living in his father's shadow so long he'd forgotten he could cast his own. The ranch didn't need to be exactly as his father left it. It needed to evolve. To adapt. To survive in a world that kept changing whether Jake wanted it to or not. Why did he choose you? Jake asked. Why did he trust you with this? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Because I failed once, and he helped me learn from it instead of being destroyed by it. He knew I'd understand what you were going through. Loss. Fear. The weight of expectations. He thought maybe I could show you what he showed me, that failure isn't the end. It's just information. Data you use to make better decisions. That night, Jake lay in bed thinking about everything Sarah had said. 3 days ago, he'd wanted her gone. Now he was starting to understand why his father had trusted her. She wasn't here to take anything from him. She was here to give him something he'd lost, hope. On the fourth day, everything fell apart. Jake woke to find Sarah in the barn, her phone pressed to her ear, her face pale. When she saw him, she ended the call abruptly. We have a problem, she said. The problem was Marcus Webb, the neighboring rancher who'd been trying to buy Jake's land for years. Webb had somehow learned about Jake's financial troubles and had filed a complaint with the county, claiming Jake's cattle had damaged his fence line and destroyed his crops. It was a lie, but it was a lie backed by falsified photographs and a lawyer who knew exactly how to exploit Jake's vulnerable position. If the complaint went through, Jake would face fines he couldn't afford and legal fees that would finish what the drought had started. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. This was it. The final blow. Webb had been waiting for this moment, circling like a vulture, and now he was moving in for the kill. He wins, Jake said, his voice hollow. I can't fight this. I don't have the money for lawyers. But Sarah's expression had changed from shock to something harder. Something determined. Get dressed, she said. We're going to see Webb. What? No. You don't know this man. He's a bully who thinks you're weak, Sarah interrupted. And bullies only understand one thing. Strength. Your father taught me that. They drove to Webb's ranch in tense silence. The place was twice the size of Jake's, all modern buildings and expensive equipment. Webb himself met them in his driveway, a satisfied smirk on his weathered face. He was a big man, intimidating, used to getting his way. Matthews, he said, ignoring Sarah completely. Come to discuss my offer? I'll still pay fair price for your land, despite the trouble you've caused me. Sarah stepped forward before Jake could respond. Marcus Webb, she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge Jake had never heard before. "I'm Sarah Chen. I run a private equity firm in San Francisco. I specialize in agricultural investments. And I'm here to inform you that as of this morning, I've purchased Jake Matthews' outstanding debts and refinanced his operation. I've also filed a countersuit for harassment and defamation. The photographs you submitted were taken on your own property, not Jake's. I had them analyzed by 3 independent experts. You tried to frame a grieving man to steal his land." The color drained from Webb's face. Jake stared at Sarah, his mind reeling. She'd bought his debts? When? How? "Furthermore," Sarah continued, pulling out her phone and showing Webb the screen, "I've contacted the county commissioner about your water rights violations from 2019 that were never properly resolved. I've also reached out to several of your business partners about investment opportunities. They were very interested to learn about your current legal troubles." Webb's hands clenched into fists. "You can't." "I already did," Sarah said. "Drop the complaint. Apologize to Jake. And never come near his property again. Or I will make it my personal mission to ensure everyone in this county knows exactly what kind of man you are." The drive back to Jake's ranch was silent until they were halfway home. Then Jake pulled the truck over to the side of the road and turned to Sarah. "What did you just do?" "What needed to be done," she said simply. "You bought my debts? You're refinancing the ranch?" "Sarah, I can't let you." "You're not letting me do anything," she interrupted. "This is a business investment. Your ranch has potential. Real potential. I saw it in the numbers, and I see it in you. Your father asked me to help you save this place. I'm helping." Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," Sarah shot back, her voice rising for the first time. "This is a partnership. You work the land. You make it profitable. You pay me back with interest over 10 years. If you succeed, we both win. If you fail, I lose my investment. That's not charity. That's business." "Why?" Jake demanded. "Why would you risk your money on me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Sarah looked out the window at the passing fields. When she spoke, her voice was softer. "Your father saved my restaurant chain when I was drowning in debt and bad decisions. He didn't have to. He didn't know me well. But he believed in me when nobody else did. He taught me that success isn't about never falling down. It's about who's willing to help you get back up. I'm here because he can't be. And because the man who raised you deserves to have his legacy continue." Jake felt tears burning his eyes. He'd been so angry at his father for bringing Sarah into his life, for this bizarre arrangement, for leaving him with so many questions. Now he understood. His father had known Jake would need help. Had known pride and grief might destroy what generations had built. So he'd sent someone who understood. Someone who'd been exactly where Jake was now. "I don't know what to say," Jake whispered. "Say you'll fight," Sarah replied. "Say you'll trust me for 3 more days. Say you'll stop seeing this ranch as something you're going to lose and start seeing it as something you're going to build into something even better than before." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he'd been too blind to see before. Not an enemy. Not an intruder. A partner. An ally. Maybe even a friend. "Okay," he said. "I'll fight." The 5th day began with Jake and Sarah standing in the ranch office at 5 a.m., surrounded by papers, laptops, and cold coffee. The room looked like a war zone, but it was the kind of controlled chaos that came from people working toward something instead of running from something. Sarah had spent half the night on calls with her business contacts, and Jake had finally opened up about every problem, every debt, every failed plan he'd been hiding. "Your biggest asset isn't the cattle or the land," Sarah said, pointing to a map she'd spread across the desk. "It's location. You're 40 minutes from 3 major cities. You've got infrastructure, water rights, and beautiful views. You're thinking too small." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah pulled up something on her laptop and turned it to face him. "Agritourism. Farm-to-table experiences. Educational programs for schools. Corporate retreat facilities. You keep the working ranch, but you diversify income streams. People will pay premium prices to experience authentic ranch life. To learn about sustainable farming. To disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature." Jake's first instinct was to reject the idea. His ranch wasn't some tourist attraction. But then he thought about Sarah's words from earlier in the week. "Stop surviving. Start building." "Show me the numbers," he said. They spent the morning running projections. Sarah showed him operations in Montana, Wyoming, and California that had transformed struggling ranches into profitable businesses without losing their agricultural roots. She showed him the demand, the pricing models, the startup costs, and the potential returns. By lunch, Jake's head was spinning with possibilities he'd never considered. Would need to build guest cabins, he said, getting caught up in the vision. Maybe restore the old barn for events. Create trails for horseback riding. Partner with local restaurants for the produce we're already growing. Exactly, Sarah said, and she was smiling now, really smiling. It transformed her face, made her look younger, more alive. You'd start small. Maybe 3 cabins the first year. Test the market. Build reputation. Then expand based on what works. Your core cattle operation stays the same, but now you've got additional revenue to weather bad years and invest in growth. That afternoon, they walked the property together, and Jake saw it through new eyes. The creek that ran through the western pasture could be a fishing spot. The ridge with the sunset views could host small weddings. The old bunkhouse could become a rustic vacation rental. Every problem became an opportunity. Every liability became an asset. I can't do this alone, Jake admitted as they stood on the ridge, looking out over land that suddenly seemed full of promise instead of burden. You won't have to, Sarah replied. I meant what I said about partnership. I'll help you develop the business plan. Connect you with contractors, marketing people, the right investors for equipment and infrastructure. I'll come back quarterly to review progress and adjust strategy. You're not alone in this anymore, Jake. Something shifted in that moment. Jake had spent 3 months feeling like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now, for the first time since his father died, he felt like he could breathe. Like the future might hold something other than failure and loss. They spent the evening making lists. Everything that needed to happen in the next 6 months, the next year, the next 5 years. Sarah was methodical, breaking down overwhelming tasks into manageable steps. Jake contributed ideas born from his lifetime of knowledge about the land, the seasons, the rhythms of ranch life. Together, they created something neither could have built alone. Why did you really buy my debts? Jake asked as they took a break, sitting on the porch steps under a sky full of stars. The truth this time. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When your father helped me, I was ready to give up. Not just on my business. On everything. I couldn't see a way forward. The debt was crushing me. The failure felt permanent. He sat me down, looked me in the eye, and said failure only wins if you let it. He spent 3 months teaching me how to rebuild. How to see opportunities instead of obstacles. He didn't want anything in return. He just wanted to help. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. 2 years later, my restaurants were profitable. 5 years later, I sold the chain for enough money to start my investment firm. Everything I have, everything I am, exists because your father took a chance on a stranger. When he contacted me a year before he died and told me about this arrangement, I understood why. He knew you'd need what he gave me. Someone who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. Jake felt his chest tighten. I wish I'd known about you. About what he did for you. Maybe I would have understood him better. He was a private man, Sarah said. He didn't do good things for recognition. He did them because it was who he was. You're more like him than you realize, Jake. You just needed someone to help you see it. The 6th day was a whirlwind. Sarah had arranged for a photographer to come take professional shots of the ranch for the website Jake didn't know they were building. She'd brought in a web designer she'd worked with before, someone who understood rural businesses and authentic marketing. Jake found himself being interviewed about his family history, his vision for the ranch, his philosophy about sustainable agriculture, things he'd never articulated before but discovered he had strong feelings about. By evening, they had a website framework, a social media strategy, and the beginning of a brand identity that honored the ranch's heritage while pointing toward its future. Jake was exhausted but energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. Tomorrow's my last day, Sarah said as they reviewed everything they'd accomplished. How do you feel? Jake looked around the office, at all the plans and possibilities spread out before him. Terrified, he admitted. But also hopeful. Is that normal? Sarah laughed. That's exactly right. If you weren't scared, you wouldn't be taking it seriously. Fear means you care. It means the stakes are real. The key is not letting fear make your decisions. What if I fail? Jake asked, voicing the question that still haunted him. Then you'll have data about what doesn't work, and you'll try something else, Sarah replied. But Jake, you need to understand something. You've already succeeded at the hardest part. You stopped running from change. You opened yourself to possibility. Everything else is just execution and adjustment. You've got the skill, the land, and now the plan. The only way you fail is if you give up. And I don't think you're a quitter. That night, Jake barely slept. His mind was racing with plans and ideas and a future that felt real for the first time since his father died. Sarah's final day started like the others had, early and with purpose. But there was something different in the air, a bittersweetness that Jake felt the moment he walked into the kitchen and found her making coffee. In just 6 days, she'd become part of the ranch's rhythm. The thought of her leaving felt wrong, like losing something he'd just discovered he needed. They spent the morning with Jake's lawyer and accountant, finalizing the refinancing agreement and establishing the partnership structure. Sarah had worked out terms that were fair but firm. She was investing real money, taking real risk, but she also believed in real accountability. Jake would have quarterly goals, performance metrics, and regular check-ins. It was professional, businesslike, and exactly what he needed. "You're really going to make me work for this," Jake said as they reviewed the contract terms. "I'm going to make you succeed at this," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference. If I let you slide, I'd be doing you the same disservice everyone else has done, underestimating you. Your father didn't underestimate people. Neither do I." By afternoon, they'd finished the paperwork and returned to the ranch. Sarah began packing her few belongings, and Jake felt an unexpected panic rise in his chest. A week ago, he'd wanted her gone. Now he wanted her to stay. Not forever, he understood she had her own life, her own business to run. But the ranch felt less lonely with her in it. He felt less lost. "I'm going to miss this place," Sarah said, looking out the window at the fields bathed in golden afternoon light. "There's something peaceful about it. Something real. My life in the city is all glass towers and conference rooms. This feels like breathing." "You could come back more than quarterly," Jake said before he could stop himself. "I mean, for the business. To check on progress. Whatever." Sarah turned to him, and there was something soft in her expression. "I'd like that. But Jake, you need to know, you're going to be fine without me here. Better than fine. You've got everything you need to make this work. You just had to remember how to use it." They walked the property one last time together, and Jake found himself pointing out details he'd never shared with anyone. The spot where his grandfather first taught him to ride. The tree where he'd carved his initials when he was 8. The field where his father had told him the ranch would be his someday. Stories and memories that had been locked inside him, finally finding their way out. "Your father would be so proud," Sarah said quietly. "Not of what you're going to build, though that's impressive. But of who you've become this week. The man who was afraid to change became someone brave enough to embrace it. That's the real transformation." As the sun began to set, they stood on the porch one final time. Sarah's truck was packed. The contracts were signed. Everything was in place for Jake to begin the next chapter of his ranch's story. But neither of them seemed ready to say goodbye. "Thank you," Jake said, the words feeling inadequate for everything she'd given him. "For the investment, yes. But more for believing in me. For seeing something I couldn't see in myself. For being what my father knew I'd need." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You gave me something too. A week away from the corporate world. A reminder of why I do what I do. A chance to honor a man who changed my life by changing yours. That's not nothing, Jake." She climbed into her truck, and Jake thought about all the things he wanted to say. About how she'd arrived a stranger and was leaving a friend. About how the ranch felt different now, lighter somehow, like she'd lifted a weight he didn't know he was carrying. About how he hoped this wasn't really goodbye, just see you later. "Sarah," he called out before she could start the engine. She looked at him, waiting. "I'm glad he sent you. I'm glad you came. And I'm going to make this work. Not just for me, or for his memory. But for you too. You took a risk on me. I won't forget that." She smiled, and it was a smile full of warmth and confidence and something that looked like affection. "I know you won't. Call me when you get the first cabin built. I'll be your first guest. It's a deal." Jake watched her truck disappear down the long driveway, dust rising in its wake like it had when she'd arrived. But everything was different now. The ranch was still his. The challenges were still real. The future was still uncertain. But he wasn't facing it alone anymore. He had a plan, a partner, and something he'd lost 3 months ago when his father died, hope. He turned back to look at his ranch, at the land 4 generations of Matthew's men had worked and loved and fought to keep. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be hard days ahead, setbacks and surprises and moments of doubt. But Jake was ready now. Sarah had taught him that strength wasn't about never needing help. It was about being brave enough to accept it when it came. He walked back into the house, pulled out the business plan they'd created together, and began making notes. Ideas for the first cabin. Names for the agritourism program. Marketing strategies to reach the right customers. His father's photograph watched from the mantel, and Jake could almost hear the old man's voice. "Proud of you, son. Knew you had it in you." 3 months later, Jake stood in almost the same spot on the porch, but the ranch had transformed. The first guest cabin was under construction. The website had launched to surprising interest. 2 school groups had already booked educational tours for the spring. The cattle operation was profitable again thanks to the changes Sarah had suggested. And Jake had paid his first installment on the loan, right on schedule. His phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. They talked every week now, sometimes about business, sometimes about life. She'd become more than a business partner. She'd become a trusted friend, someone who understood both his struggles and his dreams. "How's the cabin coming?" she asked. "Ahead of schedule," Jake reported, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Should be ready by next month. You still planning to be the first guest?" "Wouldn't miss it," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm proud of you, Jake. Your father would be too." After they hung up, Jake sat on the porch steps and watched the sun set over his ranch. Over his future. A week had changed his life, but it wasn't magic. It was hard work, honest conversation, and the willingness to trust someone who saw potential where he'd only seen failure. Sarah had given him tools, knowledge, and belief. But the transformation had come from within. She just helped him find it. The ranch would never be exactly as his father left it. It would be better. It would be his own creation, built on a foundation of tradition but reaching toward innovation. And somehow, Jake thought, that would make the old man happiest of all. Not a son who preserved the past perfectly, but a son who honored it while building something new. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake made a promise to himself, to his father's memory, and to the woman who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. He would succeed. He would build something lasting. And someday, when someone else was struggling and lost, he'd do what Sarah had done. Show up, believe, and help them find their way forward. That was the real legacy. Not land or cattle or buildings. But the willingness to lift others up, to share knowledge and hope, to transform lives with belief and action. His father had understood that. Sarah had proven it. And now it was Jake's turn to carry it forward. 1 week had changed everything. But the story was just beginning.